Okay, I think I've got this right, maybe. Try to turn it a little bit like that. Hopefully we can see it fine. The white lettering isn't as good as some of the black lettering. Um, so same thing as kind of the other videos, just trying to do it live to be able to answer questions or things like that. So these are going to be notes 17.1. If I can, there we go. Still not as clear as I would like it, but my head gets out of the way. I think that's part of it. Screencast-O-Matic doesn't have a live platform, so it makes it a little bit harder. So let's talk about Kennedy and the Cold War. This lecture is really important because it helps you understand what exactly was happening in Vietnam at this time and kind of all the other pieces that fit into that. So Kennedy was different than Eisenhower. You see this picture here of Kennedy and Eisenhower shaking hands. Kennedy was elected in 1960. He takes office in 1961. Now, we talk a ton about Kennedy, even though he really was only president for about 2 years because he was assassinated in 1963. But one thing that Kennedy did differently than Eisenhower was that he focused on nuclear and guerrilla warfare. So, like Eisenhower was very concerned that we weren't staying up to the same level as the Soviets were when it came to guerrilla warfare and nuclear warfare. So, a lot of the funding for not only the Navy SEALs but also specifically the Green Berets in the Army was actually during this time. Now, one of the things that he really focused on was that flexible response. Any type of conflict. He wanted people to be able to respond in any type of conflict. So yes, we need to have nuclear weapons, but if we don't have people that can go in and solve these small problems in some of these communist countries or help the Turkish people out through covert ops, then we don't really have what the Russians have. The other thing about Kennedy that makes kind of a big difference here is the fact that he not only was concerned about communism, but Kennedy was more about, instead of us just being strong on against communism, he wanted us to be a strong overall country. So a lot of like the really patriotic things that you kind of hear come from Kennedy, like ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. All those kinds of things. One of the things that he wanted to promote was about the country being strong, and that was our biggest defense against communism. That communism itself would implode upon itself, but we have to make sure that we're a good democracy. That kind of makes sense. Kind of being like a good country. So when we look at Kennedy, not only did he focus on the Cold War, but he had some other focuses that were different than others. Oh, it works. Okay. As long as people can see it. So the Peace Corps. You may have heard of the Peace Corps before. There's a picture here. Like I just need to move over. No, that just makes it bounce. There's a picture here. That's much better. So my head's kind of out of the way. Of Kennedy meeting with some of the Peace Corps members there. You know, the thing about the 60s is we have a young president. A lot of people that are coming of age at that time, they're really feeling that kind of like responsibility to the world. The idea was that they would volunteer. The Peace Corps would be American volunteers for not only technical things, but also educational and health services. Now, this Peace Corps is different. It's not like military. It's supported by the government. It's a great thing to add to your resume, especially people typically in between like undergrad and graduate school. They want to go into something like public policy or something like that. Sometimes the Peace Corps gives them that great experience. A lot of places that they went was Africa and Latin America. The whole idea behind this was to show people in places like Brazil or Colombia that we cared about them more than just militarily, that we were willing to help invest into their society and be a part of them. The Alliance for Progress was about giving loans and money to Latin America, but the whole point of that was to not to kind of it's kind of the same idea of the Marshall Plan. We're going to give you food because we want you to like us, and we want you to know that we care about it. So it's kind of like you don't want problems in your backyard, so you keep them happy. So, oh, I had a sound effect, and that whole map is gone. I'm going to get some better technology in here. All right, so when we look at, let me try to turn this light down. Maybe that helps. That does help. Okay, that's all right. I'll just be the blackface here. Can't see me. Thousands are going to leave Cuba, and when Castro takes order. Now, when Castro takes over, he implements a ton of limitations on freedom, and he's also willing to work with the Russians. He's very against America. Most of the people that left Cuba were the middle and the upper class, because that's typically what happens in the case of a dictator. The middle and upper class, they have the means to leave Cuba. During Eisenhower's presidency, the CIA had planned an invasion of Cuba. Now, the CIA is not allowed to basically work on American soil, but they're allowed to work internationally. So the idea was to invade Cuba with its own people. So take what we call exiles, Cuban exiles, and make them, arm them, train them militarily, and then basically send them back into their own country to take over their own country from this dictator. It's a great plan, except it wasn't very well implemented. Wow, that's really bad. I wonder if I put my hand over here. Nope, it's still white. Maybe if I turn it this way. Nope. This way? No. This way? No. Okay. One of the biggest things that we see, try this. Nope. I don't know. The bottom part here does not, it seems like on the video it's not reading as well. I'm going to try to get another screen instead of our projector. I think that will work for our next set of notes, but we'll just have to do with what we got today. So it didn't happen under Eisenhower. There was around 1,400 of these exiles, and so we put them into a plan of action, and they began the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion, these Cuban exiles land, and if you could see the map, I would show you where it is in Cuba, but it's called the Bay of Pigs invasion because it was in the Bay of Pigs. It's like a bay in Cuba. They land, they don't have any protective cover. They're basically mowed down with Castro's machine guns. And they're asked, hey, America, please help us, please help us, please help us. And all of their cries for help, basically nothing, they didn't get any protection. Because of that, I don't know if you can see this. I'm trying to kind of, oh, well, it's not what I wanted to do. That's a little better. 1,400 invade, 1,100 die. Only 300 people made it out of there. So that kind of made it difficult, obviously, because it turned a lot of Cubans against us. I don't know if you can see this here, or if you're trying to follow along on the notes. It strengthened Castro. It turned Cubans against Kennedy and the United States. So it actually did the opposite of what we wanted it to do. It gives Castro more strength because it looks like he won a battle, but it also makes the Cubans feel like that we don't like them and we're not going to take care of them. Now, let me see here. Make sure I'm on the right page. Okay, I'm going to put these there's 2 video clips I'll have you watch later on. All right, so let's look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. That seems to work a little better. If there's less white, it seems like the glow is different. So the Cuban Missile Crisis was in 1962. The Soviets were building nuclear missile sites in Cuba. We were very concerned about that. This plane is basically flying over Cuba and sees that there's these missile sites there, and they're like, "Hey, that's not good." If you don't know where Cuba is, and this map is kind of showing you that, you cannot tell. I'll be honest, you really can't. But it gives you mileage, and one of them was on here is Denver, Seattle, Los Angeles, Mexico City. Basically, any of the rockets that the Soviets had at that time could reach any major city, not just Miami, even though Cuba's only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And that's Key West, by the way. So Kennedy's concerned. They have the missile sites built, they just don't have the missiles there. So he enacts what's called a naval blockade. Basically, he lines up his ships out here in the Gulf of Mexico, and he does not allow the Soviet ships to bring any more supplies. But they basically, the boats met in the middle of the sea, but nobody shot at each other. Kennedy becomes this hero. Like, basically, we went toe to toe with the Soviets, eye for eye, but we didn't blink first. Khrushchev is the one that backed down. Eventually, the Soviet ships sat within firing range of American ships in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico for a couple days, and they turned around and went back home. After that, Kennedy asked Khrushchev if he would establish a hotline between Moscow and DC, basically a way that they will communicate even more. Following this, we have the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963. All above ground nuclear tests are banned, and 23 other nations signed that, which was amazing because if you remember me talking about that in the Cold War, like, it's very good to have that. All right. So, try to move that a little bit. In Vienna, in 1961, prior to this whole Cuban thing, Khrushchev wanted the United States to leave Berlin, West Berlin. Kennedy refused. Obviously, this is the same thing that we've done. You guys remember the Berlin airlift? The same thing that we've been dealing with. At this meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev, they actually both got mad at each other and left sooner than they were even supposed to. And Kennedy said, "I will not sacrifice democracy to keep a friendship." And Khrushchev said, "The Americans are either going to get out of West Berlin, or we will push them out of West Berlin." Now, what eventually happens is Khrushchev just begins to build the wall. So the Berlin Wall begins in the 60s. A lot of people think it begins more in the 50s, but the 50s was actually more of a Berlin airlift. It wasn't actually until Khrushchev that we actually have this wall. When the wall begins, it kind of starts as almost like the defiance of Khrushchev. "Ooh, you know, I don't like you, and I'm going to build this wall." And Kennedy responds by sending 1,500 troops to Berlin that weren't there before, increasing the troops. Basically saying, "I'm not going to let you take control of this either." The wall was constructed by the Soviets and built by East Berliners, whether they wanted to or not. They weren't really allowed to not be a part of building the wall. Ooh, these are not doing as well. Okay, so the Vietnamese rebel against the French after World War II. It almost seems better. All of a sudden, we're jumping to Indochina. I know. So we have all these Cold War things happening, but then Vietnam kind of becomes another Cold War battleground. I'm going to try to lift that up just a tad if I can. There we go. I don't know if that really helped. Maybe a little bit. So after World War II, the French began to rebel and say, "Hey, we don't want to have anything to do with the French." It was a colony. It had been taken over by Japan, and it was eventually the French troops. Okay, go tell your dad. Sorry, interruption. Okay. So Ho Chi Minh is this revolutionary leader that travels around and basically tries to convince people to support Vietnam. He wants Vietnam's independence. The problem is, for a long time, yeah, I know that was my son. Apparently, his bike ran out of gas that doesn't have gas, but when you're 4, of course, it has gas. So he wanted Vietnamese independence. In the beginning, he didn't care who listened to him. He would have supported capitalism, he would have supported communism, whatever. He just wanted a free Vietnam. Eventually, no one listens to him, and so he begins to find support in the Soviets, and he becomes communist. Because of Ho Chi Minh's communist leanings, he becomes kind of the firebrand in Vietnam. Now, our involvement, well, that's a wash. Okay. So anyway, it's basically foreign aid that we've sent to different places. We sent it to France. We sent it to the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Yugoslavia, the Congo, Pakistan, Egypt, and South Vietnam was in that. All right, we'll just have to keep going. So America has this decision. Vietnam is a colony of France, but France has anti-communist forces in France, and we want to keep France as a friend. We're worried that we may not keep France as a friend if we don't support them in Vietnam. But the other issue is, if we don't support them, then what's going to happen? Are we going to this whole decision that we have to make? Are we going to lose France as our friend, or are we going to support colonization? Remember, colonies are long, old, like that's history one stuff. That's how we were established. We didn't support that in the 60s. No, we were more about free government. Eisenhower's worried about losing French support, so he gives money. We actually give $2.8 billion. You can read that to French for control, to try and control Vietnam. But we refused. He said, "I will not give any troops into colonization." He couldn't do that. The other idea was that if Vietnam fell, this one you can actually see, probably because it's black. If Vietnam fell to communism, then Japan, then the Philippines, other places would fall. Vietnam being the first domino to fall, you know how a stack of dominoes fall? Then Laos and Cambodia, which is in the same area, if you remember from your world history, and you may not. Thailand, you hear a lot about Thailand today, or see it on your clothes. Burma, eventually maybe even India and Bangladesh. Now, that would have been huge if India would have fallen to communism at that time. You think how large India, I mean, between India and China, there's two of the largest populations in the world. But we did not surrender. Yes, I can put them on Plain Book. Yeah. If you're having trouble, I don't know. I've been trying to work with this, but it hasn't been working out. So the French surrendered in 1951, and the Geneva. So they surrender and they say we're not going to try to keep Vietnam, but the Geneva Accords split Vietnam into North and South Vietnam. If anybody would have learned anything in the 50s from Korea, it would that to split a country between North and South is probably the wrong idea, and they had 2 years to unify. So, like, we created we didn't, but the French in Geneva, when they set up their peace process, kind of messed up the whole, end result. It's flipped on you guys because I flipped it because it was showing backwards on my screen. Let's see well, that's kind of what I was talking about with China. China had already fallen, North Korea had already fallen, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, that would be a part of the falling there. Let's see how much we have left. I think that's our last one. No, we have a little more. Oops. Um, where's my mouse? There we go. Um, I don't remember how I flipped that though, because I flipped it because my screen was showing it opposite. All right, so we'll just go and then I'll post it later too. CETO basically was to contain the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. So the whole point of that was kind of like NATO. So we had friends in Southeast Asia, and that's what that map shows that you can't really see. Ngo Dinh Diem was the nationalist, and Ho Chi Minh, that I talked about before, was the communist. They were the two candidates in the 1956 election. They had 2 years to figure out how their country was going to unite. But Diem, the nationalist, refused to participate when he started to lose. This is him here. He was actually a Princeton graduate. He had come to the United States, had learned our ways. He was very good at speaking English, things like that. The Viet Cong were guerrilla fighters that were wanting to unite Vietnam under communism, but they weren't able to. Actually, Diem was against Buddhism. Now, that's a really big problem because most of Vietnam, whether they were supportive of capitalism or communist, they're Buddhist. He was Christian. He had been Christianized when he came to the United States and lived here for like 8 years and attended college. He was very westernized, so a lot of people didn't see him as a traditional Vietnamese. So, because he was against Buddhism, it actually really hurt him. One of the reasons that they give for that was that the people that were for Buddhism felt like he was not on their side. So the special forces, oh, that one you can actually see if it's not flipped on for some of you. The special forces were to advise the ARVN, which is the ARVN, it was the something Republic Vietnamese National Forces or something like that. Basically, they're troops of South Vietnamese. Around 1963, we had about 1,500 American troops that were in Vietnam. They were only as advisement. They were not supposed to be actually engaged in the battle. The Buddhist priests are going to set themselves on fire, which is right here. Here's a picture of one here. There's a picture of one there. When we watch Poison Dreams on Thursday, you'll actually see actual footage of that. It was really funny last year when I was last semester when I was teaching this in the fall to that one junior class I had. It was the same time that a freshman had tried to set himself on fire in the Commons, if you guys remember that. And so, like, the very next day, I was like, so I don't think he's Buddhist. Anyway, you get the joke. Diem, even though he didn't participate in the election, he takes power as the president, tries to take power over all of Vietnam. North Vietnam is like, no, we support Ho Chi Minh. He's our Buddhist leader. He's, the one that we're going to support. And eventually Diem was assassinated. Because of that assassination, it kind of spirals the whole country in out of control as far as stability. This is a very small country, but it's highly populated. I think that's the Buddhist priest setting themselves on fire thing. Oh no, that's the Maddox. I'm going to send you that video clip because that's really important for understanding how this happens. So, how did America really get involved? Because I told you that it was one of those things that had a big impact on America, but it also it doesn't really seem like we're involved in a small country with instability. Were we worried about the domino theory? Sure. But how do we send a massive amount of troops for 8 years into one conflict? And we have all these Vietnam veterans today and all these issues, and you hear how it was like not a legitimate war, that kind of thing. Well, in 1964, now look at the time, Kennedy is assassinated in 63, November of 63. So by this time, Johnson's in power. Under Kennedy, we actually never were. We had advisors. We had the Green Berets there as advisors. We never actually committed troops to Vietnam under Kennedy. would be interesting on how different Vietnam would have looked if Kennedy would have stayed in office. The U.S. Maddox was fired upon, supposedly. I'll show you a video clip. I'll put it on Google that I'll just add it to that assignment thing that kind of gives you a perspective of a flyer that was in the area. And he could never even find anything that gave an indication the Vietnamese were out in the water. The USS Maddox returns fire because they're fired upon. And so Johnson goes to Congress and he asked them to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This is really important for understanding the Vietnam War. This resolution gives Johnson war powers that he had never had before. He had never had these war powers. And so he committed US troops to Vietnam. He fought an entire war. He increased the defensive budget drastically, but we never actually declared war. It's kind of like Congress took the war powers here and just kind of handed them off to the president and said, do whatever you'd like. Nobody actually even questioned him. They all were like, that's okay, no problem. 2 senators voted against that resolution. And if you think about that, that's crazy. Now, after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, further on, and if you take government next year, you'll hear about this. There is a actual law that is passed that's called the War Powers Resolution, and it does limit the president to not ever be able to do Vietnam again. But at this time, it was like a free pass to Johnson. And he spends the next 6 years, basically, fighting a war in Vietnam where he received the power to fight that war from a resolution passed by Congress based on one incident on the USS Maddox. So our getting into the war is a little shady. That's probably the best way to describe that. Our initial entry into the war was against the Constitution. It's based on one small incident that there's questions about. So it kind of makes the whole reason for the Vietnam War. It's one of those things about the causes of the Vietnam War that makes it really hard to legitimize it, if that's a word. Okay, so hopefully you kind of have an idea of how we got involved. I'm going to post those 2 videos, links to those under that link. Miss Brian, how do I do this? So if you're not sure on how to do this, if you read the instructions, click on the attached Google Doc, type in your notes, click turn it in when you're done. It kind of gives you that whole, I know I've had some questions about this today because people are like, I'm not sure I understand what we're supposed to be doing. We can't do it in our notebooks anymore. So put that over there. That's completely backward. But notes over the causes. Right there, it says the Google Doc. You see where the Google Docs are. Each one of you have your own copy, and you can just type the notes and then in there, and then turn that into me. And we're going to do that instead of turning anything into our notebook. All right, and that completes note 17.1. If I can find my button to get back to my YouTube link, kind of separate. There we go. All right, and I'll also post a different version of this that hopefully you can see better.